All right, let's do this. Last session of the, is it the last? No, I think there's one more after me. Thank you all, and thank you for these previous presentations. I think it's been an interesting group of kind of bouncing up and down between levels of technology. We're going to try and keep it pretty basic level and build that common understanding, because in addition to CDE and some of these other concepts, collaboration and communication has also been a big theme, I think, throughout the day. So I am here again. My name is Nathan Wood. I am from Denver, Colorado, and with the Construction Progress Coalition. You'll hear more about that and the Common Data Exchange Framework that we're trying to use in the U.S. to really mirror a lot of the efforts that, at least from afar, we're seeing here in the U.K., and interested to see where that takes our discussion. But let's dive in. So for those that are not familiar with my background, so I am a former BIM nerd or BIM elite, or I guess I do have my emblem, so I can call myself a BIM hero, but earned my stripes using Techless Structures as a general contractor with DPR Construction on healthcare projects in San Francisco Bay Area, very much that intersection of cost of work and challenges with seismic and just crazy rebar designs and other things. Had a lot of fun in the kind of heyday of what was possible, where technology really was the barrier to innovation, that we didn't have powerful enough computers to power this stuff, but learning throughout the years that it became less and less a technology barrier and more a people process. So joining DPR's corporate innovation team, allowing me to travel and meet colleagues here that I'm seeing again from Denmark and Middle East and other areas, where we're learning that there really is, as different as it is in different countries, there are some commonalities I think we can learn from each other. So it's very interesting to try and have that discussion without getting distracted and frustrated with the nuance. And really understanding that at the end of the day, this is about people and social sciences, and how do architects and engineers, and it's kind of, men are from Mars and women are from Venus, type oil and water relationships, that we have to realize that we both need each other to continue our civilization. And so how do we do that in an effective, productive way? Not that easy. And so when you throw technology on that, it just becomes that much more of a fun conversation, and really the world that I like to live in. So when we talk about common data exchange initiatives and what is the mission of Construction Progress Coalition, that again was started as a 501c3 in 2017 between architects, engineers, construction professionals, and those technology solution providers, along with our collaboration partners, to solve the shared pains that we're all facing and really better understand what are those challenges, so that we can reach the shared gains opportunities that we've seen examples of today, but just can't seem to get that consistency project after project. So the way that we hope to help these efforts and move them forward is through 4 pillars of community, publications, thought leadership, and education. Notice standards is not any one of those. Standards is a huge component of it, but it really isn't our main focus. We want to help communicate the role that standards play. And so kind of a brief history to catch up. It's the formation of 2 different groups. So I was originally part of, as a GC, the Construction PDF Coalition. We were very proud of a 4-page PDF guidelines that we produced in 2014 that had just some very basic guidelines for our architect and engineer partners around true type font and searchable text, and some basics that at least when we're getting a PDF, we can do more with it with Bluebeam and other things. Again, I know I'm amongst a bunch of BIM folks, and PDFs are still the devil, but they're better than paper, right? And so we got to start somewhere and build ourselves up and really build the habits of what does it really mean to digitize and digitalize and get that point of transformation. So throughout the years, learned that and tested out this common data exchange framework, partnered on other reports to really get the word out around what are the business drivers of this pain point and how do we solve it, because it is higher level than just a technical solution. Don't worry about that water. But ultimately we need to be producing stuff. So show of hands, how many folks are familiar with the B1M? Only 2? Oh my gosh, go to YouTube and watch everything on the B1M. Fred Mills in the UK is amazing. So, sorry, I figured I was going to get every single hand up. So go check that out. But more specifically, check out a video in 2018, I believe it was 2019, called The Power of Standards. Great storytelling around what is the real pain point, what is the real challenge, especially in the UK. It's all based on UK perspectives, but Sasha Ree, one of our co-founders, was really important in pushing that forward. But all those really are leading up to 2022 and this year, and this past February we had our first Open Integration Summit, or AEC Integration Summit, where we brought together 80 different folks across, again, architecture, engineering, construction, and technology. It was not a talk at you conference. It was a, hey, we're all the smartest people in the room anyway, representing design and construction and trades and owners. How do we get together and solve these very real problems around RFIs and submittals, payment applications, reality capture, as-built handover, and put together white paper findings to summarize those, what was found by those groups, and hope to continue these efforts forward related to existing standards efforts. So one of our groups in the CDX 2 of document handover, our conversations are still going with ISO 19650. We just had Nigel Davis was on one of our virtual roundtables talking through the UK perspective to really help those of us in the US with how are we going to adopt it. And we've had some questions from folks of, why would you do a conference in Denver in February? And of course, we do add on an optional networking day for those of you who do like to ski, like myself. And I think John Egan may be signed up already and be joining us. But hopefully here to recruit some folks, because so much of this is about how do we get the best minds from different parts of the world to come together and really ideate and improve the system as a whole. So, but again, what drives each of these initiatives, what lines us all together, is this vision of having an industry-wide consensus on the performance benchmarks of project delivery. Today, other than safety and cost and schedule, there really aren't any consistent performance benchmarks. How can we use those to drive exchange standards and all these other items around what really is driving that future? So if we use that as our sort of North Star, collaborations with all of these different partnerships, including those that are not listed, like Building Smart International and other groups that are here that we're very interested in looking for those opportunities to partner, bring those different folks together. And only because I see Mark here, the GIS world as well, because GIS and BIM integration is a huge topic right now that is a lot of uncharted territory. But as we dive into the content itself and what is CDX, I typically flow my conversations using 3 steps. And before I showcase this, I'm curious, is anyone familiar or know what this target here, or they start with blank? Can anyone fill in that blank of whatever you normally start with in a presentation? Nobody? Okay, you guys don't want to watch TED Talks, don't you? So one of the most famous TED Talks on record on YouTube is this guy named Simon Sinek. He wrote a book called Start With Why. He also wrote a book called Leaders Eat Last. And his latest one, Infinite Game. Fantastic books for this industry. Have nothing to do with construction, but everything to do with change management and leadership and how we're going to actually disrupt this industry and create that digital transformation. But I think a lot of times when we talk about why should we do digital transformation, why should we be digitally competent, we have this sort of, well, yeah, of course we should, right? I mean, everybody in their heads nodding here. But I think I'm curious how many folks have faced this situation where they come and ask you, okay, but what is digital transformation? And I think we get a lot of, I'm sure you have a very good response for what is digital transformation, but when we ask those in the industry, you get a lot of deer in headlights of, I know I need it, but not really sure what it is. And so, So as we go into the why, what, and how, I'm actually going to break my rule of Simon Sinek. We're going to start with what and go into what is digital transformation. So I look at, and I found, of course, through Google, a great graphic that looks at the 3 stages that lead up to digital transformation, starting with digitization. So what is that transition from analog to digital, the paper to something that is not just electronic, but has some sort of source of digital within it. But a lot of times that can actually create more waste in and of itself. Getting something from analog to digital is fundamentally waste. Digitalization, which you've heard a lot of that word today, and probably a lot of interchanging between those 2 words, is actually the improvement of existing business processes with digital technology. Again, APIs, data, cloud, IFC, you name it, but actually changing the process. And then ultimately at the top is looking at the business system, looking at the mechanics and the drivers of why you do something and actually changing those through the use of technology. That's a profoundly different way of thinking about BIM, about thinking about everything from contracts all the way through. And what ISO 19650 and other things are getting us towards, but to really break down, like, what stage are we in? Are we just in digitization where we care about the data and we're going to pay for it? Are we in digitalization where we're actually improving internal processes? Or are we at digital transformation where we're working with our partners to actually change the client's experience from the project level? So after we now understand what is digital transformation, the next question is, okay, I put this CDX thing in the title. What the heck is a common data exchange? So I will be first to clarify, it is not a standard and never intends to be a standard, but it is a visual framework that supports project delivery stakeholders with developing the next generation of interoperability protocols built on open data standards, which again, we've talked about a lot of those today. So what does that mean? is really, again, about a language of understanding what makes construction unique, and it starts with the stakeholder. So we say stakeholders all the time, especially as product managers. Any user of the software is a stakeholder, right? No. The stakeholder is the company at the project level that signed that contract that has a business interest in that project, which is different from the persona, the individual that works for that stakeholder that has maybe some intrinsic or extrinsic interest in the company's interest, but really is more all about themselves, right? I mean, especially the more we hire Gen Z into our industry, they are going to care about themselves. If there's not something in it for them, they're not going to care. So personas and stakeholders, creating that separation is an important first step. The next step is creating systems, separating systems from documents. So a system of record, or an SOR, would be a digital or physical location where project information is retained, organized, and or accessed. Now, I did not use the word contained, because a container, and I know if John Egan was here, we'd be splitting hairs and he'd probably be jumping all over the place, and I love having these debates because this verbiage continues to evolve. But a system is different from a document of record in that the document is a legally recognized container for point-in-time information that can have different statuses of submitted and closed that it goes through, and would have maybe different sets of metadata associated with each of those status phases. But a document is going to go through essentially a static life cycle, whereas a system of record is going to be that ecosystem that's going to maintain in perpetuity, or at least across the life cycle of the project. So if we're understanding kind of those different components of the systems and documents and personas and stakeholders, we can then start talking about the activity itself, when we're actually generating or sharing information. And if we're generating it, it's that persona activity that's using an application like BIM 360 Field, or insert whatever application you want in there, to a certain document like a quality form. And then they can exchange that information by either manually entering it again, or other, hopefully more digital and less labor intensive and opportunity for risk or error activities. And ultimately, these activities will be tracked in a sequence, and that'll help you kind of tell and paint those numbers of what is happening in this workflow. And the color coding that associates with them is essentially the activity of, am I originating, am I creating information, am I providing it, sharing it to someone else, am I controlling it and checking it, validating or verifying it, am I aggregating it, bringing it together between different systems, or am I just there to receive and consume and access it? So, and again, there's more stuff on CDX, there's some stuff on tiers and stuff on barriers that, frankly, we just don't have time to go through. But I do want to get into how it's applied and how it's used, in at least in its current state. And so it's really, again, used as a communication tool, especially to describe the nuanced difference between an internal exchange and an external exchange. So this first example of an internal exchange is an upload, again, of a prefabrication manager that fills out their quality form in BIM 360 Field, and that uploads into their EDMS or document management system, whatever you want to call their internal system. So that vertical move is an internal move versus an external exchange, where information is shared from one stakeholder to another stakeholder. And again, because that activity involves two manual steps, we would identify that as a shared pane for that general contractor that is an opportunity for us to resolve and create shared gains from. So in its basics, one way, again, because it's always tough to create these analogies, so sometimes we'll just do this with a household or sort of like consumer example. So in this case, if I want to email from my iPhone, we were talking about iPhone users before, and I want to use Gmail because I'm a G Suite customer, there are, of course, through that app store, an ability to download that app. And I'm still amazed at folks that will say, oh, well, Autodesk and Bentley, they would never share data together. That's against their competitive advantage. Like, no, that theory went out a long time ago, and we have all these examples that we can combat against. Same thing with Apple TV and Google Chromecast, and the reality is that sometimes this is not the case, and when it is, people make a big stink about it. And I think we're starting to see, the more we talk about inequities in data sharing, we'll get rid of that excuse, so that all that's left is our issue of contracts and process. So again, two examples of shared gains. And then the question becomes, all right, so what do we mean by aligned? And there's really three steps. Here, I'm gonna grab that water over here. So there's really three steps. First one being the aligned incentives. So why are we doing this in the first place? Too often I think we have rose-colored glasses as to why we are collaborating and don't actually get into the nitty-gritty of the contracts and the incentives. So step one, do we have aligned incentives? Then we can start talking about aligned expectations. So under that shared objective, Do we all understand the role that each of us need to play? And then we can start asking that question around technology of, do we have the capabilities in place? Are the APIs, are the data standards in place to actually support that decision? But too often we jump to that third, can we do it, without ever asking the question of, are there incentives to support it, and do we have aligned expectations? And just to highlight, in case folks are not familiar with the fact that the technology is no longer the barrier, if you've been onto Procore's app marketplace, I think there are over 300 apps now that you can download. And again, some of them are internal within your organization, a timesheet to a project management solution, or others, but there are much more increasing examples on both the Procore as well as the Autodesk Construction Cloud ecosystem of integrations where we are actually sharing externally. And the one that I want to highlight specifically is one by Nuforma. So it's actually produced by Rivet, one of our CBC members, that has built an active integration where you can essentially, as a general contractor, write that RFI, submit that RFI inside your Procore. It will automatically create that new RFI inside Nuforma for the architect or engineer, send them that notification inside their Nuforma system. So it's actively pushing and pulling that information between the two systems. Very rare to see that progressive of an integration, but it's awesome that that exists today, because the next question becomes, okay, is the architect and the GC from an IT perspective okay with opening up their systems to this API? A lot of them get blocked at the IT level because we're not able to explain to them that security protocols are handled, or maybe if they're not, there's something we need to change. Those are the conversations that we're getting to now so that we can adopt these systems. And not to get too nerdy, but if you really want to dig into like how do we solve this problem, I've been doing research recently on Danella Meadows' project and this idea of leverage points and looking at the system of a project and all these mechanics of the way we've always done it and how do we change that system. And there's some really interesting points in some of the points to intervene in a system. I'll just highlight a couple of them here around the strength of negative feedback loops and thinking about how much do those negative feedback loops actually impact our ability to innovate, and how do we challenge those and really start to challenge, again, the rules of the system, the incentives, the punishments, the constraints, because at the end of the day, that's the core of what's preventing innovation, not the technology anymore. So as we move from how into finally now back to why, which is really where we should have started, curious show of hands, how many folks recognize what this graph represents? You got one. Okay. So this is why I ask these questions, because I have a US audience where I expect everybody to know this. It's okay, I bring in the whole graph. So in about 2015, I believe it was, McKinsey came out with this report around construction productivity and how manufacturing and all other non-construction was almost two times as productive as the construction industry is. And it just lit a flame for venture capital, for all this. I mean, the reason why I'm out here in Europe is talking about this is because of this graph. And it's now become a laughing joke where if you put this graph in your presentation, you just kind of get like, oh, boo, because we're so sick of seeing it. But of course I had to put in here because I knew we'd have some folks that hadn't seen it before. But this is a huge why, and we can't neglect this why, but we have to understand, why does this why exist? We have to do a root cause analysis. So one of the reasons, we pulled this information from a slide from Google that I thought was amazing about the challenges, and you can just kind of read through. Those of us that are architects are very familiar with a lot of these disclaimers and things that we see, but in this kind of, I guess, disheartening reality that it is counterintuitive to do BIM on many project contract types, unless you're in certain situations. And so you have to ask, okay, well why does that exist? And it's just this age-old kind of historical culture that virtually everyone in construction supply chain works on contracts where the incentive is to maximize their gain at the expense of others. And so until we change that paradigm, which is that number one reason at the bottom, the leverage points, if we don't fundamentally believe and align on this, nothing else matters. We shouldn't even be talking about data. So there's just so much, I can't overemphasize the why, and that the why has to be personal. So again, I would have presented this in the beginning if we were doing why, what, how, but we're at the end, so I'll talk about this now. I mentioned earlier I came out here from Denver via Iceland Air, and if you were to fly back, I would recommend do not check your bag with them, because you'll lose it for multiple days and have to find an outfit for under 100 euro. But if you do make it back to Denver, you'll see, Mark knows this, we live in a historic kind of urban neighborhood called the West Highlands, and they got some very interesting city permits and other requirements. We're actually going through currently a renovation and just submitted documents to the city, which has been a process. I will not take any more time to tell you that. But one way that we're using technology is actually two different use cases. So the first one, very obviously, as with a historic home built in 1906 that we're about to tear the roof off of, we want to know what the heck is there before we actually put in new items, especially if we're going to start looking at any prefab or modular options. So we did a full laser scan of the interior, exterior before we ever started our design. We can talk about all the issues with surveying and other points that we found along the way, but ultimately came up with a reliable source model for us to then do that design. But really, again, at the end of the day, and as my wife's standing back here, hopefully she's not embarrassed, but the main reason, because you guys may not all know, but not everybody can read a floor plan. Not everybody can see the same way as architects and designers and builders what is there. They have to actually see in that one-to-one scale. And even in AR on an iPad, like it just does, if you've done the experience, it's not the same. But it's not that easy today to get BIM into a hands-free Oculus Quest 2 that isn't hooked up to a beefy VR computer, but thanks to Iris VR and other efforts, like it's amazing how low the bar is becoming for some of these efforts that do really provide value. But if we don't understand what was the reason why we were doing that in the first place, then again, it never really matters. So just to conclude, after talking about why, I think the big question, especially in construction, becomes when. And it was brought up earlier, the hype cycle, so I don't have to do the explanation. Thank you very much. And agreed that the right time to adopt is really kind of at that past the trough of illusionment, getting that slope of enlightenment. So the question now is, as we look at different types of technologies, like, say, BIM versus drones, that you can almost follow if the first one's BIM and drones following behind, that just because BIM got a faster start doesn't mean it's further along on that hype cycle. The drone hype cycle went very fast, and mainly because of a lot of the FAA regulations, at least in the US, that were resolved, and things that were previously barriers that no longer became barriers that allowed it to pass through. And the only reason that I'm putting BIM at kind of that slope of enlightenment is it depends on the contract you sign. It depends on all these things as to whether or not that will be successful. So as we close out, another graphic and a great report from Deloitte University Press on how digital is rewriting the rules of business. We've all felt and can see that that disruptive tension of the technology change and how that's impacting our expectation on traditional linear business productivity. But the way that they're describing, the way I really understand, the way I now come to strategize around it, is that it's not actually one tipping point. There's actually 4 different tipping points in that sequence of the technology has the capability, the individual is willing, the business has an incentive, and then there's a public policy that supports that. And so we are very much in this industry at that intersection of the business incentive and the public policy transformation that can actually support this sort of again, system level paradigm shifting change. So how do we get these folks that do not speak digital, that do not speak BIM, that don't even speak construction to understand the importance of this? We can start speaking dollars. We can start speaking people and making more sense to them. And so I'm happy that we've got so many great collaboration partners. Obviously, AC Hive, thank you again to Ralph and everything that has been done here to bring these folks together, because we need different perspectives from different groups to come together and solve these problems. So it really does take a village, and we appreciate all the support from collaboration partners, including AC Hackathon. They're a great incubator. And with that, yeah, I will pass it off, and I'm sure we'll get into questions.